Glad to see you here today. It's going to be the first day of our annual Bible series, and we are talking about Moses and a full life of faith. And today we got Brian Egerton is going to start us off with it. I'll do a longer introduction during the worship time, but for now, if you've not met Brian before, then we're excited to have him back. Brian grew up here at Washington Avenue, and certainly he was a very, very active person in the youth group, and certainly we're thrilled to have him back here. Brian has worked for a number of years at the North Lexington Church of Christ in Lexington, Kentucky, and he's currently at the Seven Oaks congregation in Mayfield, Kentucky, and you've been there for 3 months. And Haley and Luke are with us today as well, his wife and son, and which is all very exciting. So Brian's fantastic. I've done a lot of things with him over the last 20 years plus, which is kind of wild to say, but you will be blessed. We are thrilled to have him. He's going to introduce our concept today with the first two lessons of Moses, and the connection with God will be our first lesson, and then we're going to deal with conquering fear and the way that Moses did that and how that impacted his faith. There's a lot of lessons we can pick up from that as well. Brian is going to bring us that lesson. So, Brian?
Well, good morning. This is a unique morning for me. In being in ministry, I'm not able to be at many other places other than the congregation I'm working with on Sundays. And so I don't get to be at Washington Avenue very often on a Sunday morning. And especially don't get to speak at Washington Avenue very often. Every time I'm here or different things, they talk about how I was an important part of the youth group and did a lot of the things here. But I have never been invited back in 12 years since I was in college, so I don't really know I don't know what that means. So I'm excited to be here with you all this morning, and excited to be able to study together, challenging us to grow in our faith this morning. And we're going to be focusing on a man, Moses, during our Bible class hour and our worship hour. And we're going to learn a little bit about what it means and what it looks like to have a life full of faith, for our faith to take root and to grow and develop and to really change our lives and change the way we approach and attack this life that God has given to us. So as we introduce this idea, we're going to begin by talking about what it means to be connected with God. But as we introduce this concept, let's think for just a minute together about this idea of being connected. We live in a world where it's never been easier to be connected with people, right? You think about the technology and the advances that we have in communication and how easy it is to reconnect or to connect with people. If you have Facebook or social media, how many friends do you have on your account, right? Hundreds of people probably, right? And we have all of these people, and man, it's never been easier to check in and go to their page and see what's going on in their life and like one of their pictures, and we can feel like we're connected. But are we really connected? We talk about it's never been easier to be connected, but I wonder, are we truly as connected as what we claim to be? I would submit to you that simply being able to check up on someone's Facebook and liking a picture of someone, that's not really connection, right? Just simply sending a message to someone and saying, hey, I haven't heard from you in a while, I hope you're doing well, that's not truly being connected. But yet, we talk about in this world how connected we are and how easy it is to be connected. And I think that's maybe why we struggle truly being connected with God as we should. Maybe that's why so many people struggle with this idea of truly being connected with God and developing this real relationship with God, because the reality is connection implies relationships. Connection implies relationship, right? If we are truly going to be connected with someone, it means that we actually have a relationship with them. It's not a surface level, I know a little bit about you, you know a little bit about me. It's not a, hey, I saw your post, and so I know what's happening in your life, at least yesterday. That's not connection. Connection implies a relationship. And the way I know this is because my guess is that if you were to ask any wife here in the audience, that if their husband simply liked their post on Facebook or simply said hi as they passed in the hallway, they would not feel connected to their husband, right? But yet, when we talk about other people, we say we're connected by simply those things. And maybe again, when we say we're connected with God, are we doing anything more than just, maybe we come, we're here. Maybe we pray before meals. Maybe we do little things, but do we really have a relationship? See, the challenge for us to think about this morning as we consider what it means for our faith to come alive and have a life full of faith like Moses is we need to understand the importance of truly having a relationship with God. And that's the only way that we are truly connected with Him. You know, when I think about this relationship that we're to have with God, I two simple ideas that I think are really foundational ideas for us to think about as we get into our lesson. Number one is this relationship that we're to have with God is a reciprocal relationship. That there's give and take, right? James tells us in James chapter 4 and verse 8, that he says, draw near to God and He will draw near to you. You know, sometimes we fall into this trap where we think, you know, as long as I show up and I'm here on a Sunday, I've got a relationship with God and He's pulling His weight, He's coming to. Are we truly seeking God? Are we truly drawing near to Him? Are we doing what we can in our lives to ensure that our relationship with Him is what it should be? Because the only way that we truly connect with God and we truly draw near to God is when we put in the work, we put in the effort ourselves. I heard someone once say, if we're not as close to God or connected with God as we used to be, who moved? The answer is God, right? Or the answer is us, I'm sorry. The answer is us, not God. It's not God. This is why I haven't been invited to come back in 12 years. The answer is us, right? God is never moving from us, right? God is always longing to draw closer to us. And so when we are not as connected as we should be, it's because we have chosen to step aside or draw away from God, and our relationship isn't what it should be with Him. It's a reciprocal relationship. There's give and take. Every relationship is that way. But we need to understand that that's the same with our relationship with God. We have to be willing to put the work in and put the effort in to ensure that our connection with God is what it should be. Here's the second kind of foundational idea. It requires dependence upon God. If we're truly going to be connected with God as we should, then we must learn to depend on God. In John chapter 15, verses 1 through 6, Jesus talks about, He reveals an aspect of His identity where He said, I am the vine. And if you remember in this discussion, and we'll dig more into it tonight in the discussion groups, so I invite you to make sure that you're here tonight, because we're not going to spend as much time in John chapter 15 as it deserves this morning. But in this discussion where Jesus reveals an aspect of His identity where He said, I am the vine, He says, I am the vine and we are the branches, right? And in this discussion, what He talks about is as long as the branches are connected to the vine, then the branch is able to receive the nourishment that it needs to grow and to bear fruit and to be successful. But whenever the branch is separated from the vine, then it dies off and it withers. What Jesus is helping us to understand is when it comes to our relationship with God, we need to learn to depend on Him. If we're going to be successful in this life, it means that we remain connected with Him and depend on Him. And as long as we are connected with Him and we are working with Him, then we are able to grow and be successful and accomplish what God has called us to accomplish in our lives. So, as we think about this concept of being connected with God, we need to understand, number one, we've got work to do. We've got to make sure that we are constantly seeking to draw closer to God every day. And number two, that we are learning to depend on Him. That we recognize that our lives are never going to be fulfilled or never going to fulfill the purpose that God has put before us unless we truly depend on Him and we long for that connection with Him. And what's so impressive is when you look at a life, and I think all of us could probably picture people, there are people in this room that have an incredibly strong and deep connection with God. And they are seeking God constantly, and they've depended on God, and we see their faith blossom. And we see their faith take off in an incredible way. We see them learning to put their full trust in God and letting God accomplish incredible things in their life. See, the more connected we are with God, the more our faith comes alive. And this is the idea that we're going to see in the life of Moses. See, when we are first introduced to Moses, when we get into Exodus chapter 3, the life of Moses is separated into 3 40-year segments. And his second 40-year segment, he has been living in Midian. He has not really had much of a relationship with God, if any relationship with God. We're not told a whole lot about it. We know that he was at least still religious. He had some faith, but he doesn't seem to be practicing his faith the way that he was called to. And so he didn't have a connection with God as we get into Exodus chapter 3. But what we see is from that point forward, he begins strengthening his connection with God. And we're going to talk about a number of different ideas about what it means to be connected, what it looks like to be connected with God that we learned from Moses. And what I want us to notice is the difference in his faith from Exodus chapter 3 till we get to, we're going to end in Numbers chapter 14. But we're going to notice the difference in his faith throughout that process as he continued to look for opportunities to connect to God. Okay? So, I want us to begin in Exodus chapter 3. Exodus chapter 3. Starting in verse 1. The Bible says, "Now Moses was tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian. And he led the flock to the back of the desert and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. And the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire from the midst of the bush. So he looked, and behold, the bush was burning with fire, but the bush was not consumed. Then Moses said, I will now turn aside and see this great sight, why the bush does not burn. So when the Lord saw that he turned aside to look, God called to him from the midst of the bush and said, Moses, Moses. And he said, Here am I. Then he said, Do not draw near to this place. Take your sandals off your feet, for the place where you stand is holy ground. Moreover, he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face and was afraid to look upon God. Now here we see Moses being reintroduced to God. And he sees God in the form of this burning bush that's not being consumed. And God calls out to him from the midst of the bush. And did you notice, what did God say about the place where Moses was coming to meet God? This is holy ground. What made the ground holy? God, right? The presence of God. This was not a special place that had unique meaning because of something that had happened there. It wasn't holy because of some special event or incredible demonstration of faith that took place. It wasn't holy for any other reason than the fact that God was there. That place was special because God was there. And God told Moses, I want you to remove the sandals off your feet and recognize the significance of this place. And Moses, in verse 6, even though he did not have any kind of a connection really with God at this point, he was afraid to look upon God, and he hid his face. He recognized who God was. He recognized the authority of God. He recognized the power of God. You see, when we are connected with God, we comprehend the blessings of being with Him. When we are truly connected with God and we begin strengthening our connection with God, we begin to comprehend and understand the blessings of being with Him, the blessings of having Him in our lives, the blessing of spending time with Him, the blessing of being in His presence. You know, the more time we spend with God, the more time we are with Him, the more we understand His nature and the more we understand how special He truly is. You know, when we read through Scripture, we recognize the nature of God, and we can see it described in a number of different ways. We know that God is all-powerful, Psalm 24 and verse 8. We know that God is love, 1 Corinthians 13. God is forgiving, Psalm 130 and verse 4. God is merciful, Psalm 86 and verse 15. He is our refuge, Psalm 46 and verse 1. He's trustworthy, Psalm 84 verses 10 through 12. God never changes, Malachi chapter 3 and verse 6. And we could go on as we think about the nature of God. But the more time we spend with God, the more we recognize and understand the blessings of having that relationship with Him. The more we understand how special He is. The more we understand what He can do in our lives and how He can change our lives. The more time we spend with God and the more connected we are with God, the more we let who God is change who we are. And when we let God change who we are, then our faith changes forever. Because the more time we spend with God, the more time we long to be with Him. Because we recognized who God is. But not only do we learn to appreciate the nature of God, or recognize the nature of God, but we learn to value being in the presence of God. I wonder this morning as we all look inwardly and we consider our own faith and our own lives. I wonder this morning, were you excited to be here? When you woke up this morning, were you thrilled that you get to be in the presence of God this morning? When you woke up, oftentimes in our lives, we feel one of two ways. We think about our day, think about the events that are coming, and we're either excited about what's about to happen, or we think, I just wish I could keep sleeping. I wish my schedule looked differently. I wonder this morning, how did you feel when your alarm went off? You know, when we think about our connection with God, the stronger our connection is, the more we want to be in His presence. And when our faith becomes a chore, or our faith becomes a checklist, or we begin to think, there's so many other things that I could be doing and wish I was doing, then I think we need to ask ourselves, are we truly connected with God? But here's what I want you to understand, though. In Exodus chapter 3, Moses was 40-something. We don't know for sure. He was in the middle of his life. And he still didn't have a strong connection with God at that point. But everything changed because he began to value being with God. he understood the importance of being together with him and being in his presence. And the more time he spent with him, he recognized the power of God and recognized the nature of God. And that motivated him to grow in his faith. And we see his faith come alive, but it had to start somewhere. Maybe this morning, as you are thinking about your life and your connection with God, maybe you realize you don't have a strong connection with him right now. I want you to know that's okay. It's okay as long as we make the decision that from here on, I'm going to do what I can to strengthen that faith, to strengthen that bond, to strengthen that relationship, and I'm going to value being in his presence. I'm going to value being with him, and I'm going to seek for opportunities to be with him as often as I can, because the more time we spend with God, the more our faith comes alive. So the first thing we learn from Moses here is when we are connected with God, then we begin to comprehend the blessings of being with him. Here's the second thing. Flip with me over now to Exodus chapter 33. Exodus chapter 33. Now there's a lot that's taken place in these chapters between Exodus chapter 3 and Exodus chapter 33. And just by way of quick summary, Moses has led the Israelites out of Egypt. They're going towards the promised land. They stop at Mount Sinai, and Moses goes up on the mountain. He received the law from God, and he's been up there longer than what they thought he was going to be. And so the people are convinced Moses is gone. Right? He's not coming back. And so they quickly turn from God and call on Moses' brother Aaron to build them a golden calf so that they could worship. And Aaron agrees, and he fashions this golden calf for them. And Moses is still on the mountain, and God tells Moses what's happening, how the people have rejected him and turned to an idol, and he's furious, and Moses convinces God to spare them. And so Moses comes back down off the mountain and rebukes the nation of Israel, and now God is in a position where he is separating from the people a little bit. And what happens is Moses, instead of allowing God to completely be pulled away from the people, Moses takes the tabernacle of meeting and moves it outside of the camp and creates this place where God's presence would still be with the people, even though he wasn't in the midst of the people anymore. Okay? Notice with me, we won't read it all here, but again, Moses takes the tabernacle meeting and he sets it up outside the camp. We see that in verse 7. In verse 9, it says, "It came to pass when Moses entered the tabernacle that the pillar of cloud descended and stood at the door of the tabernacle of the Lord, and the Lord talked to Moses." So here we see that God's presence was still with the people, and there was a place and a location that when Moses went to, God was going to be there. Moses knew he needed a place where he could spend time with God. Right? He had already recognized the value of being with God. He needed to be with God, so he creates this place to ensure that he could have a place with God in his life. See, when we are connected with God, then we ensure that we carve out a place for him in our lives. God was ready to be done with the nation of Israel. And Moses said, "God, we need you. Even if it's outside the camp, we need a place for you." And he ensured that in his life, God had a standing place. There was a location where he could go to ensure that he could be with God. When I think about this idea of having a place, having time, having a position for God in our lives, I think about how hard it is in our culture, in our day-to-day, because of how filled our schedules truly are. All right, my guess is most of you parents, if you pulled your phones out and you looked at your calendar, there would be very few down moments. Right? You've got all kinds of things you got to try to accomplish this week. You got things you got to take your kids to, all these different places. You got appointments. We're so busy, and sometimes in our lives, we look at our lives and we think, where can I fit God into my life? that wasn't good enough for Moses. He said, I'm going to make sure that there is a place where I know that I can see God and I can be with God. And I'm not going to let anything stop me from having a place with God in my life. I wonder, when we think about our schedules, we think about our week ahead, how often is God one of the last things we fit into our schedule? Or how often do we say, we know on Sunday mornings and Sunday evenings where we're going to be, and we'll be somewhere on Wednesday night for Bible study, and that's enough for God. And we fill the rest of our week with so many other things. See, when we're truly connected with God, and we let that relationship with God affect our faith, what it means is we fit God into our schedule, and then whatever else we can fit is okay. But God is our priority. And we let nothing take precedent over having that connection, that relationship with God. We ensure that in our lives, I've got to make sure that God has a big piece of what I do. And if I realize I don't have time for God, then I've got to get rid of some things in my life. Because God is the most important thing to me. Having that connection with God changes everything about our faith. Specifically, it changes our priorities. Now, in Colossians chapter 3, the Apostle Paul talks about the mindset that we must have in order to accomplish this goal of ensuring that we've carved out place for God in our lives. We're said in Colossians chapter 3, starting in verse 1, "If then you were raised with Christ, seek those things which are above, where Christ is, sitting at the right hand of God. Set your mind on things above and not on things of the earth. For you died, and your life is hidden with Christ in God. When Christ, who is our life, appears, then you also will appear with Him in glory." Here he says, if you have been raised with Christ. Who's he talking to? Christians. If you have been raised with Christ, if you have submitted your life, if you have sought to have a relationship with God, right? He's talking to us, each of us. If you've been raised with Christ, then set your mind on those things above. Prioritize spiritual things. Make it a priority in your life to ensure that God plays a big role in everything that we do. Ensure that we carve out a place for God by focusing and thinking about spiritual things in this life rather than letting our mind be consumed with this world. Not only that, he said in verse number 3, he said our lives should be hidden in Christ. What that means is we should take ourselves and we should place ourselves in Christ where we are surrounded by Christ. But then he goes a step further in verse 4 and he said Christ should be our life. Everything about our life, it should be about Christ. And the reality is when we make our lives more about us or about the things we feel like we've got to accomplish in this world, then maybe we're not as connected to God as we need to be. Maybe our faith hasn't progressed as it should. And maybe we need to ask ourselves, what can we do to strengthen that connection with God? And what we learned from Moses, if we're going to strengthen our connection with God, then we need to make sure that we are carving out a place for Him in our lives. Getting rid of things in our life that take us away from God, and making sure that He fits into our life and we put everything else around Him. He should be the center of all that we do. Our connection with God means that we carve out a place for Him in our lives. Here's the third thing we learned from Moses. Staying here in Exodus chapter 33, we see, again here, that this is the same context where God has been frustrated with the nation of Israel. They've rejected Him. They've turned their backs on Him. And He has agreed, we see in verses 1 and 2 of Exodus chapter 33, that He would still fulfill His promise. I'm going to drive out the people from the land of Canaan. I'm going to deliver the land to you because I promised I would. I'm going to fulfill this promise to you. Okay? But skip forward with me. Let's, I think I put the wrong passage on there. Let's move forward to, starting in verse 12. It said, Then Moses said to the Lord, See, you say to me, Bring up this people, but you have not let me know whom you will send with me. Yet you have said, I know you by name, and you also have found grace in my sight. Now, therefore, I pray, if I have found grace in your sight, show me now your way, that I may know you, and that I may find grace in your sight, and consider that this nation is your people. Verse 14, And he said, My presence will go with you, and I will give you rest. Then he said to him, If your presence does not go with us, then do not bring us up from here. I love this statement from Moses. Maybe one of the most powerful statements in Scripture. God said, I'm going to fulfill my promise. I'm going to make sure you have the land. And he says, but my presence isn't going to be with you. I'm not going to be with the people because I can't be around people that have turned their backs on me. I can't be with them. And Moses says in verse 15, well, God, if your presence isn't with us, don't deliver us. We don't want to be anywhere where you're not. What he says is, I'm only going to go where you go with me. I love that statement. God, I know the land of Canaan that you promised is going to be special. You've said it's a land that flows with milk and honey. It's a land where we're going to have everything that we need. It's a land where all of our concerns and all of our cares are going to be taken care of. We're going to be provided for in a way that we've never experienced in our lives. But God, we don't want that if you're not there. Don't give us that land if you're not going to be with us. It doesn't matter how great it is. We don't want it if you're not going to be with us. When you think about your connection with God, can you honestly say, I'm only going to go where God goes with me? I'm only going to do the things that I know God is with me. Every decision I make, I'm only going to make that decision if God is with me. Every word I speak, I'm only going to say it if God is with me. Can we honestly say that we're never going to go or do anything if God is not going with us? We think about what it means to have a connection with God. I think this hits the nail on the head. I'm never going to let my distance from God be enough that I can't remain connected with Him. And if He's not willing to go here, I'm not going either. It doesn't matter the value it's going to bring to my life. It doesn't matter how much maybe physical gain that this decision is going to give me. If God's not going with me, I'm not doing it. It's not worth it to me. You know, the proverb writer in Proverbs 3, he says, trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding, but in all your ways acknowledge Him and He will direct your paths. What he's saying is when we are connected with God and we put all our faith and all of our trust in Him, He's going to guide us where we need to go. There's never going to be a place that we should have to say, hey, God, would you come with me here? Our response should always be, God, I'm following. I'm going where you need me. You know, it would have been easy, I think, in Exodus chapter 33 for the Israelites to say, yeah, we had a hard life. We went through a lot in Egypt. We suffered immensely. And I know God's not going to go with us, but to have the land of Canaan, where we can actually enjoy life, we're going to take that. That would have been an easy decision to make. But not for Moses. Because of his connection with God, He said, God, I'm not going anywhere that you're not going with me. And the challenge for us is to have that same kind of heart and to have that same kind of mindset. That in everything we do in life, our connection with God is so strong that we never go anywhere He doesn't go with us. Let's notice one final idea we learn from Moses here. Numbers chapter 14. Let's skip over together to Numbers chapter 14. Numbers chapter 14. So again, a little bit of context. God has agreed to go with the nation of Israel. And they've traveled, they've made their journey to the doorstep of the promised land. And they send in 12 spies into the land to go and spy out the land, check out the land, kind of view the vegetation, view the cities, view the people, kind of get a lay of the land. And as the 12 spies come back, if you remember, there were 2 spies that said, oh yeah, we've got this. Right? No problem at all. God's with us. We can handle this. But there were 10 spies that said, there's giants in the land. We're like grasshoppers compared to these people. These cities are so well fortified, there's no way that we can accomplish this. Again, remember, the people that are traveling here, these Israelites, they're not soldiers. They weren't men that had been trained for years and years in hand-to-hand combat. They were slaves, right? They were forced into manual labor. They were common people. And they enter this land and they see these fortified cities and see these giants, and we can't handle that. We can't conquer those people. And do you remember, who was it that the nation listened to? The 2 spies that said we can do it, or the 10 spies that said we can't? The 10 that said we can't. The nation of Israel, they're at the doorstep of the promised land. We can't do it. We're not going to do it. And I can imagine this moment may have been the most frustrating moment in the life of Moses. This may have been the moment that his faith was tested more than anything else. Moses didn't want to be the one to lead the nation of Israel out of Egypt. We're going to talk a little bit more about it in our worship hour. He didn't want to, but God convinced him to. So now he's doing something he doesn't want to do with a group of people that have constantly been complaining, with a group of people that have rejected God, and God almost said, I'm done with you. And now they finally make it to the doorstep of the promised land, and they say, we're not going to be able to do it. And I can imagine Moses' frustration just boiled over at that moment. I can imagine he struggled so much with what to do in that situation. But notice with me what takes place. Again, we don't have time to read it all. But in Numbers chapter 14, we see where Moses goes to God. And he prays to God. He says, God, I need you. I don't know what to do. Give me wisdom. Give me guidance. Help me understand what I need to do with these people. And he casts all of his burdens and all of his cares and all of his concern on God, knowing that God was listening. Notice verse 18. Or start in verse 17. Here's Moses. He says, now I pray, let the power of my Lord be great, just as you have spoken, saying, the Lord is long-suffering and abundant in mercy, forgiving iniquity and transgression, but he by no means clears the guilty, visiting the iniquity of the father on the children in the third and fourth generation. Pardon the iniquity of this people, I pray, according to the greatness of your mercy, just as you have forgiven this people from Egypt even until now. Moses says, God, I need you. God, I learned of your character, and I learned of your nature going back to the burning bush in Exodus chapter 3. I spent time with you and learned who you were and understand what you mean to me and what you can do for me. And I understand you're a God full of mercy and a God full of grace and a God who is long-suffering and a God who is forgiving. And God, I need you. And he cast all of his cares and burdens on God because he has nowhere else to go. What else? What do I do, God? I need you right now. And the beautiful thing about this passage is that God was there. God didn't say, I told you. Back in Exodus chapter 33, you should have left them. Right? They rejected, they turned their backs on me. You should have turned their backs on them. We should have left them for dead. Because now look what's happened. They're refusing to enter even though I've promised. God didn't say that. God was there for Moses. Because of the connection that Moses had with God, he knew that he could cast his cares on God and know that God was going to listen. Know that God was going to provide. He could know that God was going to give him what he needed. See, when we are truly connected with God, we know that when we're burdened in life, that we serve a God that loves us, a God that cares, a God that longs for us to come to him, to unburden us, to help carry that weight for us, to never make us go through it alone, but to show us that he has got our back. You know, I think about individuals that go through really challenging moments in life. I had a discussion with someone last week about how do people that aren't members of the church, how do they deal with losing a loved one? I don't know. The support we gain because of God's people and our connection with God is unbelievable. See, the more connected we are with God, the more opportunities we have to be unburdened by the challenges and cares of this world. And it's when we see God coming through for us in those moments that our connection becomes stronger and our faith continues to come alive. See, here's the thought I want us to conclude on. See, when our relationship with God is strong enough that our faith is alive and God is being glorified in our lives, then we know that we are truly connected to him. When we can face this life, and in our lives, we know that in everything we do, God is being glorified because of the faith and trust I have in him, that regardless of my situations, I'm going to lean on him and trust in him, and he's going to come through for me. When we have that kind of faith, that's when we know that we truly have a connection with God. So the question I want us to consider as we close this morning, how connected are we truly with God? And what does our faith say about that connection? Every day, we need to be striving to strengthen that relationship with God. And as we continue to grow that connection, our faith changes and our trust changes and our relationship with God changes forever. Thank you all very much. Appreciate your attention this morning and appreciate your time.